Welcome to Food for Thought. My name is Colleen Patrick-Goudreau from Compassionate Cooks. I founded Compassionate Cooks to empower people to make informed food choices and to debunk myths about vegetarianism and animal rights. You can learn more about who we are and what we do by visiting our website, compassionatecooks.com. And I also encourage you to join our message board at compassionatecookscommunity.com. Welcome, everyone. I hope you're all doing well. My heart is a little heavy today as I grieve the loss of Studley at Farm Sanctuary. He was one of the goats with whom I was very close, and I'll talk more about him later on, but I wanted to dedicate this episode to him, to Studley. I also would like to thank today's sponsor, Delina McMichael, who has an intriguing story, I think. She sent me the following email. I became vegan from a total meat eater. In fact, I would classify myself as a carnivore of the highest caliber and a cheeseaholic. I'm a pit bull lover and was doing some research about the banning of certain breeds through YouTube. This led to videos about dog fights and other cruel practices, and this, in turn, led to videos about animal rights, veganism, and videos such as PETA's Meet Your Meat. I am not a person who believes that ignorance is bliss. I'm a firm believer that knowledge is power, and I'm constantly doing research on everything. After 2 weeks of research, I made the announcement to my husband that I would be vegan. I explained that this would mean not eating any animal products and getting rid of the pork chops in our freezer, and yes, the Cheese Whiz as well. I remember Cheese Whiz. I explained to him that he could choose not to do this, but that it would have a difficult time if there were animal products in the fridge for him. I knew that it would be too tempting to go back. With a little bit of mumbling, he agreed to become vegan with me. For us, there was no Last Supper. That very day, we loaded a giant plastic tote with any animal foods. Our fridge, cupboards, and freezer were nearly empty. Out went the bags of chicken cutlets, pork chops, etc. Gone were the bricks of butter, the cartons of eggs, the dairy milk, and yes, even the pancake batter with whey powder and other items were gone. My family thinks I'm crazy, and they may be right, but who really cares what they think anyway? I know what I'm doing is good for myself, for the earth, and for any children I may have in the future. Your podcast really helps me to feel inspired to do something about it besides just changing how I eat. So I thank you for your dedication, and I will look forward to hearing all of your future podcasts. I absolutely love listening to them, and I learn at least 5 new things in each one. I'll have you playing in the background when my in-laws come to visit, and hopefully they will receive some kind of subliminal message from it. After receiving Delina's initial email, several weeks later, I heard from her again, and this is what she wrote. I just wanted to share with you a little love story. I saw the photo of you with a squirrel, and my husband thought it was pretty cute. Let me tell you, one of the reasons I fell in love with my husband was because back when we were just dating, he was driving me over to meet his parents. We were close to arriving when all of a sudden, in the middle of one of my sentences, he shouted, "Whoa!" and swerved the car to one side, slamming on the brakes. When I recovered somewhat, I looked ahead, wide-eyed, wondering what he had done this for. And there, in front of our car, was a bushy-tailed black squirrel skipping across the road. He had swerved to avoid running over him, and right then I knew I was in love with this guy. The rest, as they say, is history. So if you ever want to dedicate a podcast to someone, feel free to dedicate it to my husband Joe, the guy who nearly killed us trying to avoid running over a squirrel crossing the road. Thank you, Delina, and thank you, Joe. Keep up the great work. I love those stories. That's just great. Thanks for sharing that with me. And thank you to all of the podcast listeners. If you'd like to become a sponsor, please visit compassionatecooks.com and click on Support Our Podcast. So let's see. I decided to dedicate this episode to some commonly asked questions that are concerned with where to draw the line when it comes to being vegan. Now, I'd like to think that I've covered these issues in many of the previous episodes, but because I continue to get these questions from people, I'm led to believe that I haven't done my job very well, and I need to elaborate and clarify. The first question is about chickens' eggs. The question goes something like, okay, I understand the problems with factory farmed eggs, eggs from hens who are in battery cages. I understand the problems with eggs labeled free range and cage free. But what if I have my own chickens and I take care of them and I love them and I would never kill them? What if I have hens rescued from an animal sanctuary that I adopted and will care for the rest of my life? What about a local farmer whose farm I've been to and I see how the hens are raised? I see that the hens are taken care of, they're cared for, they have shelter. What about them? Is it ethical to eat the eggs of those birds? Now, I want to make it clear that you're asking my opinion. There's no great vegan mind out there that really has the answer to these things, and I certainly don't pretend that my answer is definitive. So you're asking my opinion, and I'll just tell you what my thoughts are. Now, when I get these questions, we really have two different questions here, and I'll address each separately. In the case where you've adopted hens from a sanctuary and they're under your care for the sole purpose of living out their lives in a natural setting where they can roam and graze and sunbathe and dust bathe and do all the things that chickens naturally do, including roosting in trees if it's safe for them, I personally don't see an ethical dilemma if you choose to eat her eggs. Now, I'm talking very specifically about a pretty small segment of the population who happen to have hens who are rescued from an animal sanctuary. Hens are females. Eggs are part of the female's reproductive system. A fertilized egg will bring forth a new chick, right? And an unfertilized egg will not. So for those of you who are wondering, I don't make any assumptions about what you know and what you don't know. If there's no rooster, there's no chance the hen's eggs will become fertilized. No rooster, no fertilized eggs, right? No chick. You get how that works. So if you just have girls and they lay eggs just as they naturally do, the egg in that case is not a chick waiting to be born. If it's not fertilized, it's just merely the conditions under which the embryo would grow, but it's not an embryo itself. Does that make sense? Now, I know people who work at animal sanctuaries, where hens reside and who eat the eggs of these hens. Now, that's not always the case. Not all of them do. And even in those cases, the eggs are often hard-boiled and then given back to the hens to eat. They love them. And the hard-boiled eggs are also given to the other sanctuary animals who also love them. But sometimes the people at the sanctuaries eat them as well. So again, the scenario I'm talking about here is when an individual has hens with the very best intentions that are centered around the animal's needs, not the person's needs, in the case of animal sanctuaries, or in the case of vegans who adopt hens from animal sanctuaries. Now, these people come by these hens, these vegans come by these hens rescued from animal sanctuaries, such as farm sanctuary or animal place. It's basically adoption placement programs, right? So it enables the person, the vegan, to care for the animal in a loving home. And it also enables the sanctuary to free up space to make room for more rescued animals. Don't forget, there's limited budgets and limited space, limited resources in all of these farmed animal sanctuaries. And so when you're filled, especially certain species barns, they reach capacity, they can't take in any more animals. And that's a problem if they want to do some kind of rescue. And they do work with other farmed animal sanctuaries to adopt them out to those sanctuaries, etc. But their adoption placement program is a big part of what they do. Now, the application process is very stringent. Of the sanctuaries that I know and work with, one of the first criterion is that the adoptive family is vegan. Obviously, they don't want to adopt animals out to anyone who will wind up hurting or killing or eating the animals. So that's the intention I'm talking about, wanting to care for the animals for their own sake. And I've received a few emails from vegans who tell me that they're vegan in every way, but they have these rescued hens, and how do I feel if they ate their eggs? So, ultimately what it's going to come down to is how you feel about eating their eggs. I think that's what's really important. But if you're asking my opinion, I don't have an ethical issue with it. There's no exploitation and there is no harm created. Now, that doesn't mean I'm promoting the consumption of eggs. And that doesn't mean I'm suggesting that people go out and get their own sanctuary hens. Because as I said, it's about intention. The intention is to provide these animals with a loving home for the rest of their lives. That's very different than getting a hen because you want her eggs. I hope that makes sense to you. It makes sense to me, and that's a line that I can see very clearly. The other scenario that people bring up is, what about a farmer who has hens who are very well cared for, they're free to roam, they're protected at night, they're truly quote unquote free range, and they sell them at farmers markets. I even have a situation where our neighbors across the street have two beautiful little hens and they eat their eggs. So how do I feel about that? I can see how these hens are. They're very well cared for, not as well cared for as I would like to see, but they're well cared for, and the people care about them very much. So those are, again, kind of two different questions. The first thing I would say is that if you haven't visited and truly know the conditions under which the animals live, then I wouldn't trust any label on a package, even if it's a cute little label at a farmer's market. Some local produce farms have chickens whose eggs they sell at farmers markets when they sell their produce crops. They use the manure from the chickens to fertilize their crops, which you know from the gardening episode is not necessary, but the chickens are secondary to the operation. They're not there for their egg production. And so, do some produce farmers really care about their hens and treat them as part of the family? Absolutely. Will some of these farmers care for the hens their entire lives, providing them with medical care and shelter and food until they die a natural death? Absolutely. Will some consider these chickens just possessions to help them make a buck and replace them when they get older and when their egg production wanes? Absolutely. Will they sell them to slaughter to get new chickens? Will they kill them themselves in order to get younger chickens? Absolutely. So that's where it's a problem for me. It's a problem for me to recommend eggs from small Joe farmer, because just because a farmer cares about their flock or their animals, it doesn't mean they wouldn't kill them. As oxymoronic as that is the truth. The other question is, where did they get these hens? Are they purchasing them from the same hatcheries that make their money from hatching chicks and killing the males? I don't know. That's a question. So whereas I don't see an ethical quandary with someone who considers themselves vegan, who eats the eggs of their own rescued hens, I just cannot say that I feel the same way when it comes to eating the eggs of someone else's chickens, even my neighbors across the street. I don't know, where they got the hens. I don't know what they're going to do with the hens at the end. And I don't want to promote the consumption of eating eggs. So I'm not promoting the consumption of eggs. Again, remember what I'm saying is I'm answering the question that people have given me, like, I'm vegan, she lays eggs. What do you think about that? Well, first of all, I probably care less about the label and what you call yourself than about how you live your life and what your intentions are. So that's what that is for me. And though I don't see an ethical dilemma with a vegan eating the eggs of her rescued hens, I will say this. I don't think eggs are healthful. I certainly don't think they're necessary in the human diet. So that's a consideration I want to throw out there. They're loaded with saturated fat. They're loaded with animal fat, with cholesterol and animal protein, none of which is necessary or healthful for us. So just take that into consideration when making your choice. The other bit of food for thought I would just throw out there is this. I think the only negative aspect I can see of someone who considers themselves vegan in every other way except that they eat the eggs of their rescued hens is that there's, I suppose, the risk of keeping you tied to old habits. You may still have a taste for chicken's eggs, which means they'll displace healthier foods in your diet. You may continue to bake with chicken's eggs, which leaves you tethered to the old way, as opposed to learning to confidently bake without animal products. I also think that for some people, it can create a slippery slope. I think it just gets easier to say, well, it wouldn't hurt if I just had eggs this one time at this restaurant, or I'm already eating, my own chicken's eggs, and so a little over here wouldn't hurt. I think it could potentially force you to keep one leg in the non-vegan choices. I could be totally wrong, but that's just a problem I would foresee. I suppose the other problem would be how non-vegans view your choices, just kind of concluding that you're hypocritical or you're inconsistent. And, I don't believe in getting hung up on the purity issue, so I wouldn't worry so much about that. If someone poses the hypothetical question to you, well, if you had your own chickens, would you eat her eggs? You can just explain what I just explained. There's a difference between having hens because you want them to give you something and having hens because you want to give them something and they happen to lay eggs. Again, that's the line for me. And in fact, when you explain this to someone, when you have this conversation with someone, because the hypothetical is still a hypothetical, and unless you really do have sanctuary hens, and again, it's a very small segment of the population, it's still a hypothetical question. And so just talk to them, have a conversation about this and kind of offer the different scenarios. As I've said, I think it offers an opportunity to demonstrate that veganism is not always black and white, that some things are a little gray, and I think that it makes veganism a lot more attractive to people for that reason. The idea that some things aren't based on rigid rules, but rather on practical, logical, and compassionate considerations. Now, when it comes to the same question as it relates to a lactating animal, my answer is entirely different. I don't see any gray here. I think in the 80 plus episodes I've done so far, I think I've made it clear that it is a different story when it comes to taking an animal's milk. We like to say that cows give milk, but the fact of the matter is we take their milk. And I want to include goats here as well because they're also animals that are used for their mammary secretions. Sheep are used also for their milk, though not as often, but the same issues that I name here for cows and goats would apply to sheep as well. Biology 101. A female mammal gives milk only after she gives birth for the purpose of feeding her young. I've heard people argue that technically they can be forced to lactate without having to be pregnant. And so I feel the need to address this briefly for those who like to argue technicalities. Look, technically, if a human male has an increase in the hormones that create milk, they can lactate too. But the reason a mammal lactates is to feed her young. I think the assumption, or rather the misunderstanding, stems from the fact that technically cows, like humans, can continue giving milk for years, for a few years after giving birth. Yes, technically that's true, but only because the offspring is still, feeding, is still breastfeeding. But as time goes on, the amount of milk produced declines. For most cows, milk production increases until about 90 days after they give birth, and then it slowly declines during the rest of lactation, right? So that's technically what's going on biologically. Let's not misunderstand what's going on economically and realistically. Dairy farmers impregnate their cows in order for them to give milk. A cow is pregnant for 9 months, just like a human, and when she has her baby, she wants only to feed her baby. She wants that baby. The calf, as you probably know, is allowed to drink her milk for just 1 day. 2 days tops, maybe, but it's really just 1 day because they need to make sure that they consume the colostrum. The colostrum is the first milk the mammal produces. In the case of humans, too, it contains really essential antibodies and vitamins and minerals. If the calf does not get the colostrum, they're less likely to survive. If they do survive, they'll often get sick from some kind of infection because the body, the immune system, doesn't have what it needs to fight off disease. And this is the case for the calves who are even going into the veal crates because obviously they don't want them to die before they can chain them up for 16 weeks. So it's an economical reason they want them to get their colostrum. It's not because they care so much about the calf. So basically the baby's taken away after the first day or so, and of course the mother bellows for several days and grieves for her baby. Now, instead of being able to nourish her young with her milk, she's instead hooked up to machines several times a day, and then she's sold for human consumption. And here's what happens next. She's impregnated again. About 60 days later, she's impregnated again. Her milk is continually taken while she's pregnant, and then she's impregnated again, all the while having her milk sucked out of her by a machine. She has another baby, and the process continues until she is completely spent. She's about 3 or 4, 5 years young, and then she's sent to the killing house. Now, in the case of goats, their gestation period is about 5 months, and it's fairly common for a doe is a female goat, to have 2 or 3 kids at a time, which means you have even more offspring to get rid of. And just as with the cow's milk industry, the males in the goat industry are immediately sold and then they're killed for their flesh when they're about 12 weeks young. The females, of course, will eventually follow, just like in the case of the cows. After about 5 or 6 years, the females who have been milked for their milk, the lactating females, they're also killed for their flesh when they're about 5 or 6 years old. Goats could live to about 10 or 12 years, some breeds as long as 30 years. It depends on the breed. And whereas in the cow's milk industry, artificial insemination is more common, in the goat's milk industry, they tend to use studs, males who are kept solely to impregnate the females. And when they're no longer useful, when their semen production declines, they're sold to slaughter. And that's where Studley comes in. I don't know if I told you about Rumi and Studley when I talked about Neptune, but I can't believe they're all gone. They were goats. Studley and Rumi were goats who lived at Farm Sanctuary, so was Neptune, in California, and they were just incredible beings. They had both been studs on an organic goat milk farm, and they were about to be sent to slaughter. because their semen, production declined. And so a compassionate individual stepped in on their behalf and they were sent to sanctuary instead. Rumi was absolutely beautiful. He was sweet. He was beautiful, all white goat. Studley was his companion, and he was brown and black and tan. Very impressive horns. Very impressive horns. I got walloped a couple times. He was incredibly handsome. Rumi was just a total love bug. He was playful and he was just really cool and he was really friendly. And Studley was just the man. His name was quite appropriate for him. He was top goat at the sanctuary and he fought to keep his status right up to the very end, even when a much younger and a much tougher goat named Rufus came in on the scene, who's still there. And Studley just did not take any gruff from anyone. He insisted that you pay attention to him when you were anywhere near him, and he absolutely cracked me up. He would follow you around just to get head rubs and chest scratches, and he would just act really nonchalant, even though you knew, and he knew you knew, that he loved it. So I was planning on going up to the farm pretty soon, and I'm really grateful to Carrie. She's a caregiver at the farm who keeps me posted on the health of all the animals there, particularly the ones with whom I have a relationship. And we were actually writing back and forth just a couple days ago when she told me that Studley had had some medical issues that at first seemed pretty minor and treatable, but they persisted. So they decided to take him in for some more tests. And the next day, Carrie from California and Susie from New York both wrote to me to tell me that Studley had a seizure and died. So my thoughts are with everyone at the California shelter who has been his caretaker for these many years. He lost Rumi. We lost Rumi a few months ago. And Rumi was Studley's companion. It was definitely a blow for Studley. So we lost Rumi a few months ago, and we just lost Studley recently. So I'm so grateful to have been touched by him. He touched my life in many ways. I'm looking at his picture right now. I've had his picture up on my wall along with a bunch of other critters from the farm, and he was pretty amazing. So I created a photo album for them at my Flickr album. If you want to take a look at, if you go to compassionatecooks.com and you click on animal photos under about, you can then view all of my photo sets, one of which is called In Memory of Rumi and Studley. So here's to you, Studley. So to get back to the point, even though technically in some hypothetical world where exceptions are made and nature's really generous, a cow or a goat can lactate, or any mammal can lactate without being pregnant. This is so far from reality and so far from what's actually done that it's a totally invalid argument. And remember the process of selling males to slaughter and the females to slaughter when she's spent. This is done on small and large farms. Rumi and Studley, as I said, were on a small organic dairy farm for goats. It's absolutely not economically feasible to keep the offspring that a cow or doe, in the case of the goats, produces because they need to be cared for. They need to be fed. They need to be sheltered. There is no such thing as a kill-free animal agriculture system. Period. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. There's no way for you to have your own cow or goat without having the issue of what to do with their offspring, taking her milk, what to do with her when she's no longer productive, etc. So then someone will say, because I've heard them, well, I know some small dairy farms who keep their calves or who keep their kids, and I would say that they keep them for a short time, perhaps longer than large commercial operations do, but eventually they sell them to slaughter. There's no way around that. They're all sent to slaughter. And keep in mind that if it's an operation that exists to sell the milk of that animal, or even if they just are keeping that animal for their own consumption of the animal's milk, and they keep that calf for a short time, you still can't let the calf drink all of his mother's milk as much as he would want to. You still have to bottle feed him and give him formula because you're splitting up the milk. If you're keeping that animal for your own consumption, you can't let the calf, whose rightful milk it is, get to the milk. And an activist friend of mine, I know you've heard me talk about Ray Sikora, who's an amazing, amazing person, an activist. She told me about a friend of hers who was visiting from North Carolina and told her about a Quaker community near him where one of his neighbors has 3 cows, and they keep these cows just for their family and friends to get milk. And in order to preserve the milk for their family and friends, they put muzzles on the baby calves. And this muzzle has sharp barbs on the outside, so that when the baby tries to nurse, he hurts the mother and she kicks him away until he finally gives up. I mean, it's absolutely absurd. It's so twisted if we stopped and look at this as if we were an alien from another planet. You're stopping the baby from drinking his milk because you want to drink her milk. It's absolutely absurd in my mind. We have absolutely no requirement for the milk of another animal except for human animals. And we don't even have a need for that after a certain age. You probably remember my talking about the fact that humans stop making lactase, which is the enzyme that enables us to digest lactose, which is the sugar that's in mammalian milk, at about 5 or 6 years old. Our bodies stop making lactase. And I talked about this, I think, in the calcium episode way early on. Biologically, we're not supposed to be drinking mammalian milk after we've been weaned from our own species milk, right? But we do. And a huge percentage of the world population cannot digest this milk sugar. And so they have discomfort and bloating and gas and abdominal pain. And what do we call this? We call this a disorder. We call this lactose intolerance. It's not a disorder, it's normal. People who are lactose intolerant are not abnormal. They don't have a disorder. They're not broken. They're not sick. They're normal. We're not supposed to be drinking animal's milk because we lack the ability to digest it once we're an adult. So our body's trying to reject it. It's trying to tell us, hello, this isn't good for me. Here's a sign. Please listen. But instead of listening, we're told that we're broken. We get diagnosed as having a disorder. We are given drugs, or we're told to drink something like Lactaid. I can't tell you how many people I have spoken to who think Lactaid is not cow's milk anymore. It is still cow's milk. It's still unhealthy for us. There's still the animal protein, the casein. There's still the milk fat, the cholesterol, and all of these other problematic elements to this mammalian milk that we shouldn't be drinking. Or if we're not told to drink Lactaid, we're told to drink goat's milk, which is purported to have lower amounts of lactose. Yeah, 4.1% of lactose in goat's milk versus 4.7% of lactose in cow's milk. It doesn't seem like a big difference to me. The bottom line is it's still lactose and we're supposed to be weaned by now. So let's do what the animals do themselves and get off the animal milk. The other myth worth mentioning at this juncture is the one that declares that the animals have to be milked or they'll get sick and die. I don't know if you've heard that, but give it time, I'm sure you will. The reason I think this myth persists is because of the people in the dairy industry, the people who want you to keep buying the milk and their milk products, such as cheese. And so they make a point to tell you how much they care about their animals, making it seem like they're doing the animals a favor, right? Well, we have to milk the animals, we have to milk the cows, we have to milk the goats. If you don't milk the goats, if you don't milk the cows, it's not good for them and they'll get sick and they'll die. If you didn't artificially impregnate them in the first place, they wouldn't be full of milk. I just love how they make it sound like milking the cows or the goats is an altruistic act. We're using them and exploiting them and taking their babies and then taking their babies' sustenance, but we're actually doing it because we care about them. And amazingly, this is an argument that I have heard not only to justify using lactating females, I have also heard people use this justification for actually killing animals and eating them. Something along the lines of, well, they're here for us and we're honoring their place in this world by killing them and letting them sustain us. I mean, it's just amazing how we can pretty much convince ourselves of anything we need to so that we can feel better about it and sleep at night. The last thing I want to talk about is honey. There's this great debate about whether or not honey is vegan. And I confess that I don't understand what the big deal is. It's produced by animals. They make it for themselves. Humans create an artificial environment for them to live in, and then we take their food. Bees do not make honey for me any more than hens produce eggs for me or cows produce milk for me. So I'm not sure what the big debate is all about. Well, I know what the big debate is all about. Some people feel like honey is the breaking point for people. Like, well, I'd have to give this up and I'd have to give that up to be vegan. So what about honey? Do I have to give that up too? And I have to be really honest and say that I don't think that's the thing that keeps people from being vegan. It's people's fear of inconvenience or their fear of the unknown or their fear of being different that keeps them from being vegan, in my opinion. If honey wasn't presented as the deal breaker, it would be something else. Because really, folks, how much does honey actually factor into your life that you just can't stop eating honey? I mean, I just can't believe that people are like this close to being vegan, but then they say, oh God, it means I'd have to give up honey, so forget about it, forget the whole thing, right? I mean, if I had a podcast episode called Life After Honey, it just wouldn't have the same resonance as the episode I do have, which is called Life After Cheese. Everyone knows what I mean when I say life after cheese because people generally are consumed by cheese. But honey, let's be honest. And you've heard me say this before about other animal products. If someone tells me that they could stop eating everything else except X, and the X is usually cheese, but if it's honey, I'd have the same reaction. I'd say, great, then stop eating everything but honey for now. At least do something, right? Do do what you can. You know what I'm going to say. Don't do nothing because you can't do everything. Do something, anything. So this applies to honey as well. I know the other aspect of the honey debate is that some people are afraid that vegans would be stepping into a landmine or a slippery slope when the honey issue comes up, because there's still debate as to whether keeping bees constitutes cruelty or whether insects should be worthy of our consideration or whether bees are actually harmed when their food is taken. So the argument against considering honey vegan is that it makes veganism seem difficult or unreasonable or rigid or impossible. And I just don't agree. Because if you're already resistant to being vegan, you could make that same argument about any animal product. So I pretty much treat honey the way I treat other animal products. I don't eat it. I don't buy it. I don't buy products that contain honey or beeswax. If I consume something by accident that does contain honey, then just as when I consume anything by accident that has any animal product in it, I just move on. I do my best. But since it's not a perfect world and I'm not going to be able to be perfect, and perfection is not what I'm striving for anyway, if people ask me, well, what about honey? And they do, I just tell them how I feel about it, that I try to reduce suffering as much as I can, that my decisions are based on not causing harm and not perceiving that the world and everything in it is for me to take. It's that very perception, that very philosophy that sees everything in the world, everything in the natural world as resources to mine and use for me that creates harm and exploits nature and animals. And that line works for me. I'd rather leave the bees alone than try and justify why I should be able to eat what they make for themselves. It's just not that complicated, and people get it. I think if we get so hung up about people perceiving veganism as difficult, then perhaps we're not giving it or our ability to talk about it much credit. And maybe we're not giving other people much credit either. I don't have to have the perfect soundbite every time. I just have to tell the truth and speak from my heart, and people get it. Raise the bar, and people will rise to it. And what is honey anyway? It feels no nutritional need, and it's just one of the many liquid sweeteners available to us. Now, the people who sell honey will tell you that it's wonder food. Yeah, just like colostrum is a wonder food. Do you know what I'm talking about? If you go into any health food store these days, you'll find colostrum on the shelves in bottles and capsules for human consumption. Like, not colostrum for little baby cows who need colostrum, but for human adults. We have no more need for honey than we do colostrum from cows or from humans. And of course, infants under 12 months old should not even consume honey because their digestive systems are not yet able to handle the bacteria in honey and they may develop botulism. A wonderful plant-based liquid sweetener that has the consistency and flavor of honey is agave nectar. It's from a cactus-like plant. If you've ever had tequila, you've had agave nectar. It has the same viscosity as honey, and it's really delicious. I have a few recipes in my cookbook in the Joy of Vegan Baking that use agave nectar, like the baklava. We just did baklava in my class last month, the Mediterranean and Middle Eastern class. We did baklava, and we used agave nectar, and it was fantastic. And those of you who know the podcast know I'm a bit of a tea junkie, and in the form of green tea, but I do make ginger tea periodically, and there's a quote unquote recipe for ginger tea in the cookbook. And it's just basically fresh ginger steeped in hot water. And I use agave nectar to sweeten it. It's just fantastic. And you'll find agave in the larger natural food stores and the smaller health food stores. There's light agave nectar and there's amber, the former just having a milder taste. And of course, there's other liquid sweeteners like maple syrup and rice syrup, molasses, barley malt. But we don't have a nutritional need for any of them either, though they're all kind of touted as health food. We're talking about sugar. So let's just keep that in perspective. But when we want them as a treat, at least we have many choices in the plant kingdom, and we could live without the one that's in the animal kingdom. Now, the honey industry does try and get its product and its byproducts into many packaged products, and they like to tout them as healthful and sustainable, which gives them an air of legitimacy. And aside from getting honey into things like sliced bread, you often see honey in loaves of bread and cereals. The byproducts of that industry have also made their way into everything from lip balm and candles to dental floss and supplements. So one of the things that you have is something called royal jelly, which is a byproduct of the honey industry. Royal jelly is an incredibly nutritious food for bees, secreted from the heads of worker bees. When a queen bee is needed in the hive, a larva is chosen, and this larva is fed huge quantities of royal jelly. In fact, royal jelly is the only food source for this larva for the first 4 days of its growth, and it triggers the development of the ovaries needed to lay eggs. Someone saw the opportunity to promote this as a supplement for humans, and though its benefits have never been scientifically supported, you'll hear claims about it being an incredibly healthful supplement for humans to consume. You decide. And though it's pretty easy to live without honey and royal jelly, one byproduct of the honey industry that does show up in a number of personal care products is beeswax. This is secreted by bees to build their hives. And so, never passing up an opportunity to make a buck, people began selling this as well, and you'll find it in such things as lip balm and candles and dental floss. You'll also see something called propolis in some personal care products. Propolis, 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 is another byproduct of the honey industry. It's a plant resin collected by the bees, and the bees use it as a kind of glue for the hive, and they also use it as an antiseptic. Now, there are vegan versions of lip balm and candles and dental floss, and of course, plenty of personal care products made from plant-based ingredients and not tested on animals. I'm working on several upcoming episodes that will feature cruelty-free products and companies. I'm planning on doing a few episodes, kind of like the series, the 5 Favorite Foods series. I'm planning on doing a series of compassionate products for the home, for your closet, for the bathroom, that kind of thing. And as you can see, as you can imagine, there's so much to cover when we're talking about animal exploitation. It's amazing that I've been doing this show for 2.5 years, and I still haven't even talked about animal research or the use of animals in entertainment. There's so much to say, and I'm looking forward to providing you with more tools and resources to enable you to live in alignment with your values. I'd like to end by just thanking all of you for being who you are, for being open-minded, for being open-hearted. I'm just amazed by all of you and all of the responses I get from you. I know it's really tempting to get cynical and to think that people don't care and that things will never change, but I just don't share these thoughts. From my vantage point, I see so much change and I see so much hope, and I encourage you to find your own reasons for hoping. The animals need us, and we won't be of any use to them if we're wrapped up in our own small thinking. So plant your joyful vegan seeds and know that you are not alone. Until next time, for the animals, this is Colleen with Compassionate Cooks. Thanks for listening.